Hey, everybody, welcome to Odd and Untold, the podcast where we talk about all things strange and spooky. And this week, I wanted to explore a psychological phenomenon that might also have some leanings into the paranormal realm, the supernatural realm. I'm talking about imaginary friends. And this is something that has come up a lot in just personal conversations. I'll get into that in a little bit as to why. This will be a shorter episode this week. My voice is still a little froggy. I was feeling really awful at the beginning of this week. I'm feeling a little better now, but my voice is still kind of shot. So it'll be a shorter episode, and just forgive the frogginess of my deep voice this week. um, so maybe it's a better voice than my normal voice, but it doesn't feel right. But yeah, so I wanted to talk about imaginary friends. Again, this is something that comes up a lot, and I've heard a lot of stories from a lot of different people over the years. And imaginary friends, it's a psychological phenomenon. You know, children will often have this. I believe it's like 45 to 65% of all children will have an imaginary friend at some point. Usually starts around 2 or 3 years old and can go to around 7, 8, 9, sometimes even a little bit past that. And some kids will have like a stuffed animal, and they'll talk to the stuffed animal, and that's their imaginary friend. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking more about the imaginary friends that nobody else sees. You know, if some kid has an animal and, you know, hey, this is Teddy, my teddy bear, and I talk to him and Teddy wants a cookie. And I'm not talking about that so much. I'm talking about the kids who see an imaginary friend. And for most children, this is just part of the developmental process. They uh, invent these friends that they can talk to, and it helps them develop their social skills, their emotional skills and reasoning and emotional dealings with other people, their cognitive exploration. They, you know, especially for like first children, if there's no younger siblings, if they're just surrounded by adults all the time and maybe there's not a lot of friends around, they invent an imaginary friend, and that helps them sort of have someone to talk to that's on their level. um it's fantasy. It's just they're creating someone in their mind that they can speak to, and because they don't really have the internal dialogue yet at that age. As they get a little older, yeah, that there could be other issues going on. I'm not going to get too deep into the psychological aspects of this, um but it's not always born out of loneliness. A lot of people think, oh, imaginary friend, it's for, you know, only children who have no siblings or have no cousins, or if they're lonely. That's not always the case. It can just be that the child wants to explore certain social situations and they invent a friend. But then we have these other situations, and I'll get into some of the stories in a bit that I found from the internet. But I've had people also tell me that their children are exhibiting weird behavior. And sometimes these imaginary friends don't make sense. And there's things that they know that they shouldn't know, or these children are having conversations that they shouldn't be having at that age. Cognitively, they're not really there yet, but they're having these weird conversations with their imaginary friends, and it doesn't quite add up. And I'll start with myself. I had an imaginary friend as a child, and my imaginary friend was a cow. It wasn't a person. And again, most children who have an imaginary friend, it's a person. It's a little girl. It's a little boy. It's an, you know, um, and if they do have an animal, it's a stuffed animal. Like I said, they'll have their teddy bear. Or I had stuffed dinosaurs when I was a kid. So most animal imaginary friends are linked to a stuffed animal. Mine wasn't. It was a cow. And my mom likes to tell the story all the time about how, you know, she would go down to Fifth Avenue in Bay Ridge and go shopping. And if she didn't lash, you know, the cow to the stroller, I'd get upset and say, hey, you forgot my cow. And I was telling this to somebody years ago, and it's just a funny story. You know, oh, Jason had an imaginary cow friend. Uh, so, you know, to pause for a second there, you know, it's what cognitive or social skills are you dealing with a cow? It's an animal. And I don't remember this. I honestly don't. This must have faded before I got old enough to remember it. Other people do remember their imaginary friends, and I'll get into that. But for me, it was just this cow. And somebody had mentioned, as when I was an adult, that Bay Ridge, where I grew up, used to be farmland and there were lots of cows. And the suggestion was that maybe it was an imaginary friend. Maybe I was seeing like the ghost of a cow. And a lot of people think children can see ghosts, that they're more open to ghosts. They're more innocent. They're not taught, oh, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as Bigfoot. There's no such thing as this and that. So that children are more perceptive and they just see these things and they don't question it. They don't try to block it out of their mind. And that's another topic for another episode. But I had an imaginary cow. Uh, I was actually talking to my son last night, Jake, and he had an imaginary friend growing up. And I asked him last night if I could, mention this on the show. And he said, of course. He's very supportive of me. So thank you, Jake. And he had an imaginary friend named Davin, like Davin. Not David, not Davy, Davin. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. And when he was growing up, and this was around the time he was like 2, 3, maybe into 4, and then it kind of faded, maybe around 5, I think. I don't have the exact time frame, but he had this imaginary friend, and we always would ask questions. And Jake was pretty elusive when he was a kid. He's just my friend. He's just my friend. But when I was talking to him last night, he was saying he has some vague memories of it, and he said it was an adult man. And I it's not unusual for children to have imaginary friends who are adults, but sometimes when we hear that, there's other things going on, and we'll get into some of those stories tonight. But it's just an unusual thing. I have a cousin who I'm not going to name, but this story was passed through the family. When he was very young, he was in his crib one time, and my mother and my aunt were in the kitchen having coffee and probably smoking. It was, the early 70s. And he comes walking into the kitchen, and his mother was like, "How did you get out of your crib?" And he said, "The man helped me." So that always freaked the family out, because it was like, he didn't say like, "Oh, I climbed out," or "the man helped me." What man helped you out? And they were in an apartment, and there was no man in the apartment. It was just the 2 women and him. So very strange. And I've had other friends who have children, and they've told me stories of like their daughters seeing things and things that are talking to them. And a lot of times we'll hear stories about children mentioning relatives that they shouldn't know about, or things that happened in the past that, like, before they were born, that they should not know about. And it just gets into this real sort of gray area where, yes, children have imaginary friends. It's a psychological, phenomenon. We understand it. But sometimes these imaginary friends, there's some weirdness to it, and it makes you wonder if there's a supernatural aspect to it. So we're going to get into some of those stories tonight, but I just wanted to share some of those more personal stories about my imaginary cow and Jake's friend Davin, who was an adult male. And I can go into some psychoanalysis about that. I'm not going to do that here, but yeah, and other friends, just the man who helped me out of the crib, and friends' daughters who are seeing someone in the house, and they're both seeing it. So that's like, is that an imaginary friend if they can both see the friend? And it was an old man. So again, why are children imagining older people? Why are children imagining grandparents that they've never met because the grandparents died before they were born? Why are the imaginary friends telling the children things that are going on in the family that have been kept from the children, that the children shouldn't know about? Just very strange. And maybe it's all coincidence, but maybe not. But we're going to get to some stories tonight, and I'll talk about those. And I'd love to hear what you guys think. If you have an imaginary friend or had an imaginary friend, let me know, Jason at oddanduntold.com, or leave a comment down below. And let's get into some imaginary friend stories that are possibly supernatural. Okay, so the first imaginary friend story for this evening is from Reddit, the Paranormal Encounters subreddit. Me and my sisters shared imaginary friend attacked us every night. So here's like what I'm talking about. Like, you have 2 siblings who have the same imaginary friend, which shouldn't happen. And it could, one's talking about it, maybe the younger sibling then also imagines it, but it's weird. It's still kind of weird. And this is from Jaggy Lover 23, who says, "I don't use Reddit, but I remembered this recently and thought I would share it here. Too long, didn't read. Me and both of my older sisters shared an imaginary friend when we were children. I was unaware of this and invited him into my house, where he began tormenting us every night and scratching us in our sleep. When I was little, I would often play in a park within driving distance of my house quite often. I hardly saw my friends outside of school, and my siblings were either not there this specific time or were playing without me. And I was a very socially awkward child, so I didn't want to approach anyone. But one time I was very bored and lonely at this park and decided to make up a friend to play with. I named him Thomas, and he was slightly older and taller than me and had short black hair. I don't recall what we did at the park, but I brought him home with me afterwards. So we hear this a lot in the paranormal community of like bringing spirits home with you. Um, or in vampire lore, like they can't come into your house unless you invite them. So there's sort of this long history in the paranormal of inviting things, the uninvited. So just an interesting thing to pay attention to there. Fast forward a while, and me and my older sister began having joint night terrors involving him. We both slept in the same room at this time. I can only recall one dream we had in which he was crawling on the wall and ceiling like a spider. It was only at this time that I found out that my older sister had an imaginary friend that looked exactly like him, and this was also called Thomas. In addition, my eldest sister, who slept in a different room, also had this imaginary friend when she was around my age. It's crazy because I genuinely thought I made him up on the spot at the time. I asked my sister about it, and it turns out she also remembered him at pretty much the exact same time as I did. I'm not sure what this means. So, very strange that they're all having an imaginary friend. It looks the same and has the same name. And it seems like they weren't discussing this with each other. It seems like this person made it up, or she thought she made it up in her mind. And then both of her siblings have the same imaginary friend. Very strange. Additionally, whenever we had one of these night terrors, we would wake up with long scratches on our bodies. Waking up with scratches on my body continued for years after the night terrors actually stopped. Sometimes they were in places that I could have accidentally scratched myself in the night, but sometimes they would end up in places that would be impossible for me to have reached. Me and my sister did not share a bed, so it couldn't have had been her either. So this sounds a little bit like what had happened to me growing up. I mentioned this in our Ouija board episode. I'll link that below that John and I talked about. I would have scratches on me. In high school, we were playing with a Ouija board, and for like months, I would wake up with scratches on my back, and it was usually in places I really couldn't reach. And we would like try to recreate it, and like I could barely reach, to scratch the whole thing. I could feel little bits of it. I'm not saying it was a ghost or a demon or whatever, but make of it what you will. They continue. I believe my mother, being a Christian, assumed he was a demon or something similar and did some prayers over the house to get rid of him. But thinking about it now, I wonder if he actually ever left me alone. I kept waking up with scratches for a long time after, and for as long as I can remember, I've always considered myself unlucky. Additionally, the synchronicity between me and my sister remembering him at the same time makes me wonder if he's going to come back soon, as we are planning to move houses in the near future. So, weird. I've always considered myself a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural, but I just can't explain this occurrence. I've asked about it, and this definitely happened. There's a 0% chance my sister is lying about this happening to us. So, yeah, again, this one, it's one of those stories when you hear it, you're thinking, yeah, of course it's an imaginary friend. But then you have both siblings, other siblings. So now there's three children in this household, all seeing this entity. It's named Thomas. It looks the same. They're both having the same night terror of this thing crawling on the ceiling. It almost sounds like a Hat Man experience. And children do have night terrors, but it's one of these things, and I always say this in any of my episodes, whether it's a UFO sighting or a Bigfoot sighting, when you have multiple witnesses, that's not a hallucination anymore. And I know skeptics will say, oh, it's mass hallucination. I don't buy into that, because if one person is seeing a Bigfoot, if Josh and I are in the woods and I see Bigfoot, Josh is probably going to be like, hey, no, that's a bear, or that's a tree stump, or, there's going to be some counterpoint there. And most people are going to have that. If there's a second witness, their perception is going to be different because they're not you. They might just be a foot to your left or right, but they're going to have a different viewpoint of this. So when you have two people seeing the same exact thing, I'm not saying it means that that's what they're seeing, but it just adds credibility to what they're seeing, that it's not just one person hallucinating. It's now two people seeing the craft in the sky, or seeing the creature in the woods, or seeing the entity crawling on their ceiling like a spider. This is freaky. And again, if the children were talking to each other about their imaginary friend, I could see it becoming a shared thing. But if the initial witness is saying, no, this is something I made up alone one time, and then my sister describes the same creature, the same name, that to me is something to pay attention to. And it makes me wonder if this is more than psychological and this goes into the supernatural. So, very cool story here. Okay, this next story is titled Sophie, and this is from Ghost Stories from user M. Lot. Like most kids, I had an imaginary friend growing up. In fact, I had several, but the first one I can kind of remember was a little girl called Sophie. She was a normal girl, roughly my age, between 4 and 6, and she wore a dress and socks. However, Sophie had a very strange feature, an odd crick in her neck. My first house where I lived was an old one, I'd say roughly 80 years old, and I've grown up calling my next door neighbor Grandma, who has been in her place for the past 60 years. This is important later. Sophie was my best friend when I was little, which isn't out of the ordinary for kids. Again, imaginary friends. I just talked to her a lot, and we would play in my room, and she would never go downstairs. She told me she was scared of them, the stairs. It became routine for me to walk down the stairs, turn around, and call up, "Hey, see, it's okay. You can come down." She wouldn't, and I could never understand why. The older I got, the less I saw Sophie, and eventually I did forget about her. That was until Mum and I visited Grandma after moving houses, and we were reminiscing about my childhood there. That's when Mum brought up what had become my staircase routine when I was little, which led Grandma to question, "Who are you talking to?" I replied, "Oh, Sophie," and proceeded to describe her. Grandma went quiet and said, "You know, when I first moved into this house, my neighbors were in the process of moving out. They had a daughter who tripped and had fallen down the stairs around a month prior, and sadly, she did not survive the fall. She broke her neck." So here's one of those, it's a short story, but it's one of those stories where a child has this imaginary friend. It's a little girl with a crick in her neck. And as a child, she's not really understanding what that means. It's just a weird feature. And again, why would a child imagine a physical deformity or handicap or whatever you'd like to call it, an abnormality? Just, she had a crick in her neck. So not like most people who have healthy necks. And then years later, she finds out, hey, the neighbors had a daughter who fell down the stairs and broke her neck. And her invisible friend, her imaginary friend, was afraid to come down the stairs. And as a child, she's like, "Hey, come on, it's cool. It's cool. Like, you can do it." Very strange. And again, could this all be coincidence? Yes. And skeptics are going to say, yes, this is all coincidence. And there's nothing to it. There's no such thing as ghosts. I'm not saying this is definitely a ghost, but this is a weird coincidence. And I'll link back to a story from an earlier episode that I did where I was living in my old apartment and I heard something fall down the stairs one night, like a person, like a human adult person fall down the stairs, and nothing ever came of it. Like nobody had fallen, blah, blah, but I heard it. The house shook, only to find out years later that my great grandmother, when she was living there, she fell down the stairs late one night. It was like 3 a.m. and she didn't die, but that kind of put her in the hospital and she eventually died, but it was kind of the thing that took away her independence. Like she couldn't live alone anymore. So they put her in the hospital, never really returned home. And again, was that her ghost? Was that an echo of the past? I don't know. Just very strange that these things line up so well years later. So not sure what to make of this one, but very freaky. Okay, so our third story, another one with just way too many coincidences to not take a second look at this. And this is from the subreddit Ghost Stories. The user has deleted their account, but the story is here. Imaginary friend ghost. And they say, when my cousin's son was little, he was super attached to his imaginary friend named Joseph. He would take Joseph everywhere and do things like demand that his parents buckle him into the car. So he was definitely more attached than most kids, but some kids just have really realistic imaginary friends, so they didn't think anything was weird. And this is true. Like I said, a lot of times it's a person, it's just, oh, it's another little boy, it's another little girl. He has an imaginary friend, isn't that cute? Fast forward several years, my cousins have moved out of that house, and their son is a lot older. One day, the dad runs into the family who had bought the house from them, who also has a little boy of their own. As the conversation goes on, it gets brought up that the little boy who now lives in the house has an imaginary friend he is super attached to named Joe. Obviously, my cousin tells the family about his son, who had his imaginary friend named Joseph while living in the same house. It's interesting, but they ultimately assume it's just a funny coincidence. Again, Joseph is a common name. Joe, Joseph, we all know a Joe or a Joseph. It's common. So, okay, let's go with that for now. Fast forward again to the present day. The last family moved out of the house, and for several years it sat vacant. Recently, somebody bought the house and renovated it. One day, my cousin ran into the guy who was renovating it. They live in a small town, so it's not weird that he keeps seeing people who bought his old house. And that's true. You just, especially if you're attached to that house, you're going to just kind of keep tabs on it and talk to the people who currently own it. They were talking about the house, and my cousin mentioned the funny coincidence about the two boys having an imaginary friend with a similar name. It's the same name, Joe and Joseph. At that point, the guy doing the renovations tells my cousin that while they were taking out a wall in the house, they found an old journal that had the name Joseph written on either the cover or first page. Unfortunately, I don't think they kept the journal, but at the very least, it's a spooky coincidence. So now you have two kids, different generations, different families, living in the house with an imaginary friend named Joe. And then this guy renovating the house says he found a journal and the name on the journal was Joseph. So again, could it be a coincidence? Of course, but too many coincidences is no longer a coincidence. Too many coincidences is you have some sort of something going on here, you know. So again, I'm not sure what to make of this. I'm not going to call this definitely a ghost because Joseph is a very a very common name. It's not unique enough where you could say, oh, that's weird that two children would pick the same exact name. But all of these coincidences, two children and then the renovator finding a journal, very cool and creepy. Okay, story number 4 comes to us from the paranormal subreddit. It's from user CanSad7835. Was my imaginary friend a ghost? So again, this is not an unusual thing to question. People will have imaginary friends or their kids will have imaginary friends, and it's just things happen and it makes you wonder. So they say, lately I've been wondering if my imaginary friend I had as a kid was actually a ghost or spirit interaction. When I was a kid, maybe between 4 or 6 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Josephina. So interesting. The other one was Joseph. This is Josephina. We used to play and talk, and I remember her as clear as any other memory from that age range. I even remember her hair. It was long and dark, and she wore it in a braid. Throughout my life, I've had many paranormal type experiences. I guess I'm one of those people that are sensitive to paranormal energies. Recently, I've been remembering Josephina and wondering if she was one of those paranormal experiences. I don't think I had any reason for my brain to create an imaginary friend. I don't know what causes children to create imaginary friends, but I am not an only child. I have a sister who is only 2 years younger than me, an older brother, and I used to be babysat by my godmother, who lived next door and had 3 children of her own, all of which were around my age. I had other kids to play with and socialize plenty. But like I said at the beginning, it's not always lonely children. It's not only just single child syndrome, So, but a lot of people think that. They continue. The main thing that is making me wonder is the last interaction I ever had with Josephina. I still remember it very clearly. The last time I ever saw or spoke to her, she told me that she died because she had climbed a tree, fell off, and then got hit by a car. What kind of child imagines a conversation like this? And also, based on what she said, that means she was already dead. So then I would have been imagining talking to another dead child for all that time? I don't know. What do you all think? So this is another thing we hear with imaginary friends is when they're in that supernatural realm or people suspect that they're a ghost or something, is that the imaginary friend will eventually disclose how they died. And the psychologist in me says that maybe this is just the children trying to understand death. And it might be too hard to imagine their parents dying or their siblings dying. So they create an imaginary friend and then they imagine that person dying and what that would be like. But this imaginary friend is still talking to her, and it's an odd way to die. And I would imagine that a 5-year-old, let's just call her 5 or 6, if she's imagining her friend dying, falling out of a tree, getting hit by a car, I don't know. That's a very convoluted way to die. But it also kind of plays into common phobias at that age. Don't cross the street, you're going to get hit by a car. Don't climb the tree, you're going to fall and break your neck. So this one, that you don't have those coincidences, you don't have those really bizarre things that make me lean towards the paranormal. This, I'm thinking maybe this is just a child exploring death within her own mind. So I'm going to call this one psychological, but let me know what you guys think down below, what you think this one is with Josephina. Was this a ghost, or was this just the user, the writer here, the witness exploring death? in a way that was safe because it wasn't one of her siblings, it wasn't one of her parents, it wasn't one of her loved ones. Um, that's my thought, but curious to know what you guys think. Okay, so our penultimate story here comes from the paranormal subreddit from user Angel Fox One, imaginary friend that may have been a ghost. And they say, have you ever had an imaginary friend as a child that may have been a ghost? When I was a kid, about 3, I had a friend that my mom says was imaginary, or she thought he was. We lived out in the boonies, and the closest house was like 2 miles away. His name was Skipper, and he was older than me. So there's that thing again where it's like an older friend, not a contemporary, not someone to play with, like someone older. There was an old tree in the backyard that had fallen over. He would sit in the tree higher than I could climb, and we'd talk. He had dark hair, and I remember he had black eyes. Not just the eyes themselves, but like he had black eyeshadow all around them. He smelled like our fireplace. He knew things, like why my mom and dad were fighting, or about how the window upstairs got broken by a bird flying into it. He also said the snakes in the basement came up out of the swamps only during storms, but not to go down there ever or I'd get bit. There was a house down the road that had burnt. Mom said later one of the boys died from smoke inhalation. I often wondered if Skippy wasn't that boy. So we have some interesting things here. Some of it you're saying, okay, how did this imaginary friend know about how the window upstairs got broken by a bird flying into it? Well, if the child knew that, then the imaginary friend is going to know that. Um, he smelled like our fireplace. That is interesting to me because a fireplace has a very distinct smell. Burning wood, you have a campfire, you have a fireplace, that smell is a very distinct smell. And it can also smell like a house burning down. Houses have wood in them. So when a house burns down, it smells very much like a fireplace. Uh, and one of the boys there died from smoke inhalation. So it does make me wonder, the dark hair, the black eyes, smells like smoke. These are things she's remembering as a child. And, mom said later, so she's learning later in life that, oh, yeah, there was a house down the block that burned down. So why would the child make that connection at 3, 4, 5 years old? It just doesn't make sense. And again, maybe it's a coincidence, but you have enough of these coincidences and you start questioning, you know, is this really a coincidence? So let me know what you guys think about this one. I think this one may have something supernatural to it. It could be a coincidence, but the smoke thing, because that is a very distinct sensory memory that he smelled like smoke. He smelled like the fireplace. Why would this imaginary friend who's up in a tree, but she's smelling the fireplace? Very interesting to me. All right, last story for this episode comes from the subreddit Toddlers. So nothing paranormal. From user Scary Brandon. And he says, our daughter's imaginary friend gives us the creeps. In recent weeks, my daughter has been referring to what seems to be an imaginary friend. She's very creative and verbal for 2.5 and has a wild imagination. I had an imaginary friend myself around that age, so I'm told. Again, I don't remember mine. He doesn't sound like he remembers his or hers. But hers takes form in a completely bizarre way I never expected a child of her age to come up with. 2 weeks ago, she began talking about Shattuck being in the room with us doing various things around the house. From what we've gleaned, he is a grown man, probably similar in stature to myself or my father, wears a hat and has a tail. He sits in the high chair, sits at her child-sized table, and draws. Sometimes she will say, Shattuck is coming. Shattuck is coming down the sidewalk. Shattuck is coming to our house through the front door. It's funny, but also kind of gives us the creeps. The only concerning thing is that she seems to be scared of it. She'll run crying to my wife and say, Shattuck is coming. Has anyone ever had a creepy imaginary friend? Why is it a man? Why does she seem afraid of it? My only theory is that she sees we're slightly concerned, so she's mirroring our emotions. So I like that. There's some critical thinking here. They're trying to analyze, what's going on here. And I like that. I like when people just oh my God, it's a ghost. I don't like that. Try to think about it. But there is something interesting here in that, why is the child afraid of it? Why would the child create something that causes them terror? Not just, again, the other story where it's Josephina fell out of the tree and got hit by a car. She didn't seem terrorized by that. It was just kind of my friend Josephina told me she's dead. Just, very sort of matter of fact. And to me, that sounds more like a child trying to understand death. A little bit older, she was probably like 5 or 6. This child, 2.5, um, terrified. Usually an imaginary friend is created because they want to interact with them. They want to learn. They want to socialize. Socialize. And this doesn't sound like that. It's Shattuck is come first. Where's that name come from? Shattuck sounds like my son's imaginary friend, Davin. Like it's not a name you hear often. Again, if it was Joe or John or Mike or, you're like, oh, okay. Davin, Shattuck. Um, it wears a hat that, we hear that in the Hat Man all the time. Hat Man stories. Has a tail that is a little freaky. He sits in the high chair, sits at her child-sized table and draws. So this is like apparently a grown man, tall, with a hat and a tail, but it sits in the child's high chair, sits at the table and draws, and the child is afraid of it. Not sure what to make of this. So this is just freaky. So I understand why this guy is and his wife are a little creeped out because you kind of want to say, oh, it's cute. She has an imaginary friend. It's a cow. Okay, you have an imaginary friend who's a cow, or you have an imaginary friend who is a tall man with a tail and a hat, and your child runs screaming, crying. Shattuck is coming. Shattuck. What the hell is Shattuck? So this is a creepy one. This is definitely a creepy one. So let me know what you guys think. Is this imaginary or is this supernatural? All right, everybody. So there's 5 imaginary friend stories that I've collected and just wanted to talk about and just kind of give that range of coincidences or creepy things that the imaginary friend knows, or just an imaginary friend that might just be an exploration of death. They kind of run the gamut, but I would love to hear from you guys if you had an imaginary friend or your children have had imaginary friends that kind of seem off, that don't seem psychological, but seem more supernatural. I would love to hear about those stories. So shoot me an email, jason@oddanduntold.com, and maybe I can feature them on a future episode. Because this, as a psychologist, I have my degree in psychology. I work with children uh, in social work. So psychology, especially psychology of children, is fascinating to me. So I would love to hear more imaginary friend stories from you guys if you have them. So please share, if you will. I can keep you anonymous, of course, but this fascinates me because, again, most imaginary friends are just that. It's just the child making up an imaginary friend. But every now and then you hear these stories where these things know things, or the child is expressing things that don't make sense. You have a 3-year-old talking about death or murders, or, like I said, knowing people that they shouldn't know, or knowing concepts that they shouldn't know. It gets weird. And I've heard a lot of these stories over the years. I'm not talking about all of them for reasons, but I've heard these stories a lot, and it just makes me wonder, because I know that most of them are just psychological, but some of them sound supernatural. So until next time, everybody, question everything. Question why I'm doing this episode when I can't really talk and my voice keeps cracking and I keep having to take sips of water. But yeah, question everything. And until next time, everybody, embrace the weird, rock and roll, and beware of your imaginary friends if they smell like campfire.